The northern city of Lancaster, England, has a rich history dating back as far as the Roman occupation starting in around 75 AD. However, the rich history and beautiful surrounding areas are also the site of one of the most gruesome murders of the 20th century. The following is the story of Buck Ruxton, and a crime which shook the people of Lancaster in the 1930s. So let's take a look at the story of the man known as the Jigsaw Killer and the bodies under the bridge. The crime caught the attention of the public, and a song was written about the case. Bloodstains on the carpet, bloodstains on the knives. Oh, Dr. Buck Ruxton, you murdered your wife. Then Mary, she saw you. You thought she would tell. So, Dr. Buck Ruxton, you killed her as well. Bakhtiar Chompa Rustamji Hakim was born on the 21st of March, 1899, to a moderately wealthy family which gave him a decent start in life. His parents were of Indian and French descent and provided him with a good education, which was more than many people in India were able to achieve at the time. Bakhtiar was highly intelligent. However, even as a young child, he was incredibly sensitive and did not have many friends, which may have been an early indicator towards the behavioral traits he showed as an adult towards his wife and others. From an early age, he knew he wanted to study medicine, and with his education fully funded by his parents, he achieved his Bachelor of Medicine in 1923 at the University of Bombay, going on to become a Bachelor of Surgery the same year. He was ambitious, and he intended to make a life for himself where he would be an important person. After he qualified as a doctor, he found employment at a hospital in Bombay where he specialized in women's medicine, including midwifery. He was then employed by the Indian Medical Service, which allowed him to travel and expand his skills at both Basra and Baghdad hospitals. Living in India as an eligible bachelor meant that Bakhtiar had a marriage arranged for him, and in May 1925 he married Madhabai Jehangiri Gaidali. However, an arranged marriage and a life in India was not how Bakhtiar saw his future, and in 1926 he moved to the United Kingdom to carry on with his medical training. He was funded jointly by his parents and the Bombay Medical Service, and once he set foot in Britain, he never looked back. Apart from requesting £200 from his father-in-law, once Bakhtiar arrived in the UK, he put his wife and family out of his mind. In current times, this would have been around £8,700, which is a considerable amount of money. New name, new life. Bakhtiar started his new life with a new name. His birth name was long and hard for English people to pronounce. Also, these were less tolerant times, and an anglicized name would make life slightly easier. Whilst attending courses at the University College Hospital in London, he used the name Gabriel Hakim, although he did not legally change his name at this point. This was just his starting point, and in 1927 he relocated to Edinburgh in Scotland to join the Fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons. He was not successful and failed the entrance exams. However, the council overlooked these results in favour of his qualifications from Bombay. If the council had refused to let him in, this story may have had a different ending. Whilst living in Edinburgh, he legally changed his name to Buck Ruxton, a name that became embedded in the history of the city of Lancaster. It was also in Edinburgh that he met the woman who had become his common-law wife, 26-year-old Isabella von S. There is no record of Buck Ruxton officially ending his arranged marriage, so it was not possible for him to legally marry Isabella. Common-law marriage is a tricky term. If you have not had a legal marriage ceremony, many people do not believe you are married, and you are basically just living together, or in the eyes of the church, living in sin. Whether Buck and Isabella were truly man and wife is down to the interpretation of whether common law is the same as a legal marriage. Isabella also had a failed marriage behind her. having been married to a Dutchman in 1919. This marriage lasted only a few weeks before she reverted to using her maiden name of Kerr. Buck and Isabella courted whilst he was in Edinburgh, and when he moved to England in 1928, she went with him as his common-law wife. His medical life in England began back in London, where he worked for Dr. Manig Motorfram, who was also Parsi and then as an assistant to a Dr. B.R. Reigate. Buck and Isabella welcomed their first daughter, Elizabeth, into the world in 1929. Buck Ruxton was determined to become part of British society and fully assimilate with life as an English doctor. Always ambitious, he moved to Lancaster in the northwest of England to open his own practice situated in the property at 2 Dalton Square. This was a wise choice, as it was in a prime location in the centre of the city facing the town hall and surrounded by the houses of the upper classes. This enabled him to get in with the more distinguished classes. Buck turned out to be a popular doctor, and he was extremely well respected by the people of Lancaster, including the poor. He was one of the few doctors who was willing to waive a payment if a person was unable to pay for the treatment they needed. This kind, caring persona seen by his patients makes his behaviour towards his wife seem out of place. But as they say, you never know what is happening behind closed doors. Buck and Isabella went on to have 2 more children. Diana was born in 1931 and William in 1933. Following the birth of William, Buck decided to hire a local girl to act as a maid or nanny, and in 1933 Mary Jane Rogerson was taken on to help Isabella with the children. This was a job which her parents would grow to wish she'd never attained, although at the time it was a respectable position for a young girl. Mary Jane was 18 years old in 1933 and died at the age of 20. Buck Ruxton had a dark side which only his wife and most likely Mary and the children ever saw. Even after his conviction, the people of Lancaster appealed for mercy for the kind and compassionate doctor. However, to his wife, Buck was anything but kind. It must be assumed that at some point he was a good man towards her, as she relocated from her home in Edinburgh to be with him. But as time passed, Buck showed himself to be a jealous and possessive man towards his wife. Obviously, it is impossible to say for sure, but as you hear about his behaviour over the next few years, it is possible to speculate that he may have had some form of mental health issue, as his behaviour and moods were erratic. Buck became obsessed that Isabella had a lover, or possibly many lovers. He would accuse her regularly and would drift between periods of intense anger and times of intense depression and self-pity. His behaviour caused Isabella to run back to Edinburgh on more than one occasion, but she would always come back, usually after Buck begged her to return to him. No matter how badly she was abused, Isabella would return to her abuser. A common thing in domestic violence cases. The arguments and accusations grew over time, and on more than one occasion police were called to 2 Dalton Square to deal with the fights. The anger and violence continued over the years, and in 1932 Isabella attempted to take her own life by inert gas asphyxiation. She survived the attempt, but miscarried her child. As life continued, Buck and Isabella lived out 2 lives. To the outside world, Buck was a caring, compassionate doctor loved by his patients, and Isabella was an outgoing social person who enjoyed being with friends and acquaintances. But once they were back inside 2 Dalton Square, they lived a life of distrust and violent arguments. It is possible that the straw that broke the camel's back was when Isabella took a trip to Edinburgh with another family, who the Ruxtons were friendly with. Buck remained in Lancaster, unable to leave his practice whilst Isabella travelled with the Edmondson family to Edinburgh by train. Buck was convinced that Robert Edmondson, who worked at the town hall opposite 2 Dalton Square, was the man Isabella was being unfaithful with, and he convinced himself they were travelling to Edinburgh together to carry on their affair, despite other family members being with them. Oftentimes, jealousy does not allow rational explanations to get in the way of the scenario that is playing through a person's head. Hotel records clearly show that Isabella and Robert had separate rooms, and although this is not concrete proof of her innocence, there is no reason to suspect that they were more than friends. The details of what happened at 2 Dalton Square over the night of the 15th of September 1935 are not for the faint-hearted, and details may be upsetting to anyone with a delicate disposition. On the 14th of September, Isabella had travelled to Blackpool, a seaside resort about 38 miles from Lancaster, to see the illuminations with her sisters who lived in Blackpool. Blackpool illuminations light up the promenade, and still happen every year, and by the time she had seen them and socialised with her sisters, she did not return to Lancaster until around 11:30 p.m. At some point in the early hours of the 15th of September, it is believed that Buck finally snapped and killed Isabella and Mary. It is not known conclusively how they died, although signs suggested that Isabella was strangled before being stabbed many times. Mary was possibly bludgeoned by a heavy object before being stabbed. It was never decided if Isabella and Mary were dead when the stabbing and cutting began. The sheer amount of blood on the carpets and walls suggests blood was still pumping when he started, which means that their hearts may have still been beating. So, was this a spur-of-the-moment thing? Did the good doctor suddenly snap, or was it planned? Evidence suggests that he had decided that his wife would die before that fatal night, and he had planned accordingly. Let's take a look at the evidence to support this theory. The day before the murder happened, Buck paid a visit to one of the charwomen who he employed and told her that she would not be needed at the house until Monday the 16th of September. A charwoman was the name for a cleaner back in the day. Why would he tell her she was not needed if everything was normal? He also told the other charwoman not to come, saying his wife was in Edinburgh, which was not true, as she was in Blackpool with her sisters. His actions suggest that he may have had the murders planned at least the day before. His actions after the murders were cold and calculated, which does not suggest a man panicked by a sudden event that happened in a moment of insanity. The day after the murder, he firstly took his children to the home of a friend who lived in Morecambe. He asked his friend to care for the children for the day so that they would not be in the house whilst he disposed of his wife and maid. Later that same day, at around 4:30 p.m, he went to the home of Mrs. Hampshire, who was a patient of his. He asked if she would come to Dalton Square with her husband to help prepare for decorators who had been scheduled to come the next day. Mr. and Mrs. Hampshire went to help, and later she would testify that the house at Dalton Square was a mess. Some of the carpet had been taken up, and the bare floorboards had been covered with straw, which seemed strange in a middle-class house. In the surgery waiting room, Mrs. Hampshire found burnt towels and some of the carpets that had been removed. Buck Ruxton gave the carpet pieces to her when they left, along with a suit, as a gift if they agreed to clean them. After the clean-up, Buck Ruxton carried on with his life, at least on the outside. People were used to his wife going away, so it would not be strange if she had gone to visit family or just left for a few days. On the 29th of September 1935, Susan Haynes Johnson was out walking just outside the town of Moffat in Dumfriesshire, Scotland, where she saw a bundle on the banks of the Gardenholm Lynn stream. Horrified, she realised that poking out of the bundle was a human arm, in a state of decomposition. This started the search of one of the coldest and most brutal killers in the north of England. Once the police arrived, they conducted an intensive search of the surrounding area, including the Annan River. What they found would, I imagine, have given them nightmares. By the time the search ended, they had found the heads of 2 women and mutilated body parts in 4 different bundles. By the end of the day, they had found body parts including thigh bones, legs, sections of flesh, 1 torso, 1 pelvis, various body parts. The body parts were wrapped in bedsheets, a pillowcase, children's clothing, and several different newspapers, one of which led to the downfall of Buck Ruxton. The body parts were handed over to the specialists, and it was determined by John Glaister, a forensic scientist, and Dr. Gilbert Miller, that they had 70 human parts from 2 females. The torso of Mary Rogerson was never found. From the remains, they were able to conclude that they were looking at 2 females of different heights and ages. They noted that the mutilation looked professional, and the culprit had worked hard to make the identification difficult by removing eyes and some fingertips. From the cut marks, they decided it was done with a surgical knife. With no identification possible, they were grasping at straws as they had no idea where the bodies had come from, how they had got there, or even how long they had been there. An interesting fact in this case is that it was the first real use of entomology to date a body. Maggots found on the remains were studied by Alexander Mearns, and he was able to work out from the lifespan of the Califera vicina or blowfly maggots that the remains had been put there before the 17th of September. Without an identification for the remains, the case was at a stall. But then a connection to Lancaster was found. One of the newspapers used was the Sunday Graphic, which was only printed and sold in Lancaster and Morecambe. It was reasonable to assume that either the victims or the murderer had a link with that area. Unaware that the bodies had been found, Buck Ruxton had started to cover his back and get his story straight. On the 24th of September, he had gone to the police and reported his wife as having deserted him. He then travelled to the home of Mary Rogerson to see her parents. He told them that his daughter had become involved with a local boy and had fallen pregnant as a result. He said that his wife had run away with the girl to deal with it. Abortions were illegal in 1936, so it would not be in the interests of the Rogersons to report her daughter missing. By reporting her missing, they could be condemning their daughter to prison if Buck Ruxton was telling the truth, which he wasn't. The Rogersons, however, knew their daughter, and his story did not sound right to them. They went to see Buck Ruxton at his surgery on the 1st of October, where he changed his story. He now said his wife had stolen £30 from the safe and ran away from home, taking Mary with her. Their suspicions raised, the Rogersons reported their daughter missing to the police. It would be a further 2 days until Buck Ruxton reported his own wife missing. These missing person reports led the police closer to the answer, as they were looking for missing person reports from the Lancaster area for any women within the last few weeks. On the 9th of October, they approached the family of Mary Rogerson, asking them if they recognised any of the clothing found with the bodies. Mrs. Rogerson immediately recognised a blouse as belonging to her daughter. At this point, their worst fears were beginning to be real. Now Buck Ruxton had to play the victim. He rushed to the police station in tears, saying he had heard bodies had been discovered, and people were saying they were his wife and maid. Now, this is where he looked suspicious. Was he upset that his wife might be dead? No. He was upset that the news would be detrimental to his practice. He invited the police to search his house. What was he thinking? He must have known that by doing this he was asking to be caught. Or did he believe that his cleaning efforts would have disposed of all evidence of the murder? For an intelligent man, it was a stupid move. His actions made him the prime suspect in the eyes of the police. For Buck Ruxton, his days as a free man were numbered. The police questioned the charwoman and Mr. and Mrs. Hampshire, and the holes in his story got bigger and bigger. Agnes Oxley, one of the charwomen, told the police that she'd been told not to attend on the 15th of September, but on the 17th of September. When she had returned to the house to clean, Ruxton had asked her to give the bath a deep clean to remove some yellow stains. Ruxton had an injury to his hand, which he said he had done jamming it in a door. However, he had told the Hampshires that he had injured his hand opening a tin of fruit. The inconsistencies in his story just kept piling up. On the 12th of October, the police decided they had found their man, and Buck Ruxton was arrested and taken to Lancaster police station for questioning. Ruxton was prepared, but you must ask whether an innocent man would have prepared a document entitled My Movements, covering the 14th to the 29th of September in advance. This suggests he had some idea he would come under suspicion at some point. He said he had never been back to Scotland since he opened the practice in Lancaster, but he was outed as a liar once again. He was involved in a car crash involving a cyclist in Kendal, Cumbria on the 17th of September, and the cyclist had given Ruxton's registration to the police. Although Kendal is not in Scotland, it is north of Lancaster, and so was circumstantial evidence that Ruxton had headed north following the death of his wife. Why he offered the house up to the police for a search is mind-boggling. There was blood found everywhere, and he had to know it was there. They found blood on the stairs, the banisters, and on the carpets, despite the cleaning. They also found human body tissue in the property's drains. This was enough for the police, and Buck Ruxton was charged with the murder of Mary Rogerson at 7:20 a.m. on the 13th of October. He was not charged with the murder of his wife until the 5th of November. On the 2nd of March 1936, Buck Ruxton was tried at Manchester High Court. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, he pleaded not guilty, so a full trial commenced. The prosecutors, Joseph Cooksey Jackson KC, David Maxwell Fife KC, and Hartley Shawcross, based their case on the defendant's jealousy and paranoid tendencies, which were well documented by Lancaster police. The evidence was stacked in their favour. The defence, Norman Burkett KC and Philip Kershaw, were faced with an uphill battle, and they tried to suggest that the bodies were not actually Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson. There was really not much else they could do. Buck Ruxton did not help his own case. He acted unhinged through his evidence, breaking down on a regular basis and acting strange. He admitted his relationship with his wife was full of arguments, and that he chastised his wife, using the excuse, "Those who loves the most chastises the most." Unsurprisingly, Buck Ruxton was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. An unsuccessful appeal followed, and on the 12th of May 1936, Dr. Buck Ruxton was hanged at Her Majesty's Prison, Manchester. Interestingly, the following day a confession letter was published by a newspaper written by Ruxton and sent to be published should he be hung. If he had been found not guilty, the paper had been ordered to destroy the letter without opening it. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I know there is a ton of content out there, and I'm sincerely appreciative for you watching this right through to the end. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and hit the like button, and if you don't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and select the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of my future uploads. Also, please leave a comment on this video and let me know what you thought of it. Comments really help with the YouTube algorithm and will really help my channel to grow. You can also let me know what type of videos you would like to see more of on this channel. That really helps me branch out into new subject matters. If you have a story you would like me to tell on this channel, please email it to me at stories@daredevril.com. If you want to support my channel even further, there are a number of ways you can do so. You can buy me a coffee via my Ko-fi account, or simply help me out by sharing my content with anyone you might think is interested in watching it. Thanks again.